Welcome to Vue.js discussion panel. And today with me we have Marina Mosti, who is one of the co-authors of FormVueLate, an author of FormVueLate library for dynamic forms in Vue, and who is one of the best educators I know, creating courses for Vue mastery and explaining Vue like a pro. And it seems to be a trend because I have another great educator, Ben Hong, who is Vue.js core team member, who is co-author of the documentation together with Sarah Dresner and Fan An, and who also creates courses for Vue mastery. This feels like we have many people from there. And if you don't know me, I'm also Vue.js core team member. I also care for documentation. I'm kind of a Vue educator as well, at least I hope to be.
You are totally an educator.
Definitely.
Today we're going to discuss Vue.js, probably Vue 3, because it was released really not that much time ago. And we're still getting used to it, I think, especially in terms of documentation. So let me ask a question like an icebreaker. And this will be not the best one because we're supposed to promote Vue, right? But everything has downsides. So does Vue. So is there a feature in Vue 3 maybe in particular, that you dislike completely? Like when you absolutely hate it? So let's start with Ben and then we go to Marina. And what don't you like in Vue 3?
Yeah, I think when I first heard about some of the changes coming down in Vue 3, like a lot of people, I liked filters originally when I first used it early on, because it was nice syntactic sugar for sort of communicating like a value you had and basically how you wanted it to be formatted. So I think my gut reaction at the time was like, oh, like that's disappearing. That's a little bit of that fun Vue syntactic magic. But I think later on, after reading sort of Evan's RFC and the fact that, in Vue, we try to really let you do things the JavaScript way as much as humanly possible. And then learning that eventually, like probably somewhere in the ECMAScript, they plan on supporting single pipes to do something different. Then this means that you would then conflate the definition of what a pipe meant inside of Vue for like, is that JavaScript single pipe or a Vue single pipe? And I was like, when I heard it like that, I was like, okay, all right, fine. I'm letting it go. The filters are gone. Filters are gone.
Marina?
It's a hard question, definitely. I think from my point of view, one of the features that I wouldn't say I dislike it, but the new emits property has definitely been complicated to explain. The first time I encountered the emits missing error, I was like, I keep reading it and I was like, what is this trying to tell me? So I remember actually going to you, Natalia, because there weren't any docs back then. And I was like, can you please tell me what this means? I feel like it adds a new layer of like having to understand what is going on behind the scenes in order to, the verbosity of declaring it as sort of like component documentation kind of works, but it just adds this whole nother layer of like things you have to keep in your mind, especially in a novice perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's so true. I think first when I saw emits property, I think I saw it as a pull request in RFCs, like let's add emits property. And it was explained with some side edge case, honestly. And I was like, are we going to add this? Are we going to document this? And it also added a warning and I was like, oh, damn. But I think the most hated for me was the model modifiers we added. And for those who didn't dive into Vue, kind of banned because I was documenting. So for those who didn't dive deep into Vue documentation, in Vue 2, you had three, right? Built-in modifiers, like trim. I remember trim. Lazy, right? And something else. Number?
Number, yeah.
Number,
yeah,
again,
number.
Right? It was, so it seems like we all know everyone as one modifier. And in Vue 3, you can create your own ones. But the API is so cryptic, honestly. When I was learning, I was like, how am I going to create a contract for component with these modifiers? And I went to everyone. I went to Ben, I went to Marina, I went to Evan. Like, when it's like, could you please explain me how to use this when we have components in isolation? Because if I don't know what that modifier was used in the parent component, how am I going to expect this name? And it's still, for me, it's still such a part that I can't say hate. I have internal policy, like loving Vue because I'm in the core team, but I still don't even understand how people are gonna use this, because this is a weird one, I guess. So, like switching from this, like, okay, there are things we dislike on Vue. And again, like an interesting question. Right now, imagine you have a code base on Vue, right? Some production product. I know that Ben doesn't have currently, and Marina probably is working on some Vue product. I mean, with the Vue source code, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And Vue 3 is released. So I see these smiles, I know. Like, are you ready for the migration? Marina, you first.
So, okay. I've been trying to migrate to Vue ever since release candidate. I don't think, like, we don't have a really huge code base over at VoiceThread. One of the things that I've been working there for like a year and a half, and one of the things that I came in here to do was to actually bring over a legacy code base that was written in Backbone over to Vue. So yeah, we were still like in the middle of like, I know, I see the faces.
I'm so sorry.
We're still in the middle of this like complete overhaul over to Vue, which was so welcome by the team that was already there. But this migration to Vue 3 is something that I have been obviously been looking forward to. I had the pleasure of like starting to work with Vue when I started doing all the research in order to put out the course in Vue Mastery and some articles. And I thought, yeah, I'm ready for this. I don't need a migration guide. I don't need the tool. I'm just gonna go jump into it and get it done. And oh my God, it's just like run into so many walls, especially if you have like third-party dependencies. You can't just expect everyone to be ready. So I don't think we're ready. I think we're gonna push it back at least a month or two until we move forward with that.
Yeah, I guess. Ben, your turn.
Yeah, similar to Marina, at least the code bases I was working on prior to this, the dependencies really, I think, is the biggest thing. And then for those who, I think we still support IE11, you know, so it's just like when you have that, that's just, you know, that's not ready yet for as far as the build. So it kind of a no-go as far as full migration. But for some of like the smaller projects that support only evergreen browsers, I have found that moving from Vue 2 to Vue 3 has not actually been as painful. Actually been quite smooth in reality. And but also really looking forward to when the migration tool comes out, because I think that'll help a lot of people when it comes to switching over from Vue 2 to Vue 3.
Oh, exactly. I can share for myself because I think we have one of the biggest code bases written in Vue at GitLab. And we are ready for so much pain in terms of migration, mostly because we have a component library which called GitLab UI, and it's built on top of Bootstrap Vue. So we have components wrapping Bootstrap Vue components. I know how it does sound like, why do you even do this? Why do this with your life? But we do. And right now, I think I've seen a message from Bootstrap Vue author in their repository, like, we are starting the migration to Vue 3. And I was like, good luck, man. We'll be waiting for you, honestly. And like the whole GitLab was like, please do this. Same with Vue test utils, because we would need to upgrade our test to Vue test utils 1. We are not on 1, we are on beta 31, I guess. And then it's like, I'm so scared and so excited at the same time. It's going to be really, really hard in these terms. And speaking about migration, Ben just mentioned migration tool. But I think the tool is only for CLI, right? It's like only for CLI build projects.
That's true. I believe so, but that's a good question to ask the team for sure.
Yep. I know that Ben also is working a bit on DevTools, right? And I've tried Vue, like last DevTools with Vue 3, worked perfectly. Will we have a DevTools that are compatible for both Vue 2 and Vue 3? Because right now it's not working with Vue 2 projects, honestly.
Yeah, I believe there probably is an intention to have support for both, because it might be, as we can imagine, you wouldn't want to install 2 different DevTools in your browser, because, you know, as much as I know everyone wants to migrate to Vue 3, most of us will be probably supporting Vue 2 projects as well as Vue 3. So being able to toggle between the two is certainly a desired feature. But I think there's some issues with like the way the builds are working right now and making sure the dependencies are correct. So at the moment, if you do have both, I think you do have to have two at the moment.
Okay, I was muted, sorry. Talking about libraries, like, okay, we spoke about DevTools, but now Marina is authoring FormVueLate. How does it pronounce, Marina?
So we renamed it because there was a lot of controversial. It was very controversial, the name. It was originally FormVueLate, but no, we just renamed it to FormVueLate. We actually took out one of the T's. So yeah, it's actually the pretty good news regarding FormVueLate. It's Vue 3 ready.
Nice.
We did a silent beta release. We haven't really advertised anything, because I feel like one of the strongest parts of the library will be its ability to leverage its plugin architecture to connect with FormVueLate 2.0. So FormVueLate just released public alpha. It's still shaky. There's still definitely some bugs. There's some issues that Damien and Dobromy have been working on. So the plugin is there. It's still the FormVueLate plugin is there. It's still in alpha state, but the library itself is pretty stable, I would think. I'm kind of hoping to start getting some public testing, some public beta testers soon. But it's Vue 3 compatible. It does what it needs to do, which is render schema-driven forms, and I think it does it pretty well. And thanks to this plugin architecture, just making it so adaptable to anyone's projects is going to be a key factor, I think.
I have a question for you as actually a library author, because you were creating FormVueLate when it was for Vue 2, right? Mm-hmm. And then you were adopting it for Vue 3. So as a plugin author, do you find that creating a library for Vue 3 better, worse experience as an author, like different? How it was?
I am definitely enjoying it more with Vue 3. The reactivity system is far just easier to work with, especially when you start having to work a lot with injects and provides. Yeah, that's where we like the library for Vue 2 was good, but it ran into like this huge wall when we started to have to validate it. Because when you had like a multi-dimensional array of inputs that needed to be validated, provide inject started to like behave really shakily because of the old reactivity system. So it's definitely been more joyful to work at it as a library author. And I also am a huge fan of the composition API. So that's been a huge thing for me.
Like a question. Actually, for both of you, because I know we were authoring a documentation for plugins, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like, it's not documented on Vue 3 docs. I would say it's like we have very shallow instructions on what's going on there. So the question is like, okay, I want to write a library for Vue 3 in particular. Like I have a perfect idea of this library. I know showing pictures of cats somewhere. Where do I start as a plugin author? Like Marina, like when you were authoring FormVueLate, I'm just tensing to say FormVueLate. When you were starting, where do you find instructions on how to make a library for Vue?
I was very lucky to have to have started working on this library alongside Damien. He already had all this huge background knowledge by working on FormVueLate, VueLate and Vue multi-select. But I think you're right in that there's not a lot of like documentation or like a guide. I think there's like a hole there in terms of education. What I did was go look at what the big libraries were doing. How is Vuex handling this type of scenario? How is even VueLate doing it? Or, like the official Vue libraries. And out of there, I started to extrapolate, but it's definitely a lot of like code diving and repo diving that I did.
I know for sure. And like continue this topic of like, I want to do something, I want to create, or I want to contribute. Like, Ben, I know you were diving into DevTools lately. You know, again, like I want to contribute to some Vue project, which is not documentation, because I believe like entering and contributing to documentation is more or less fine and clear, but I want to contribute to some part of Vue ecosystem, be it CLI, DevTools. How do I even start? How do I understand the code? Where did you find like this guidance through DevTools?
Yeah, you know, so I think a lot of people, they say, you know, go to the repo, check out the label for first issue. But recently there's a book by Nadia called Working in Public, and discuss the issues of sort of assuming when people come to a repo, they have the prerequisite knowledge to do that. So while I know a lot of people may tell you that, if you want to get involved with the project, I think the key thing to start with is certainly getting deep knowledge of how everything works. So with DevTools, for example, like knowing the ins and outs of what you like about it, what you don't like about it, because then what this allows you to do is actually start answering questions when you see the issues and having those discussions. Because one of the hardest things, I think Natalia could probably speak to this, is that a lot of people have good intentions for contributing. And so, you know, they want the opportunity, but then when it comes to actually devoting the time, it's not that anyone is being malicious. It's just, it takes up a lot more free time than you realize. And so it's hard for open source maintainers to trust people to necessarily get certain things done early on, right? If you've never appeared in the repo before and you're just like, I'll take this big ticket on, or I'll write this huge PR, it's a lot of work for maintainers to review that. So I always recommend starting with something smaller, that either like if you have like an idea for something, to not just say, I have an idea, but to actually outline the proposal. Because again, the beauty of working with open source is that we don't have to like hoard our ideas. If you're the one that posts the issue and you propose the outline for how you think it should be done, this is a huge relief as a maintainer, because normally we see people, oh, I have a problem, but no one has a solution. Or if they have a solution, they don't really tell you. So then you're like, I don't have time right now. I have like all these other fires I'm trying to put out. So sharing those ideas really does help us as maintainers to then trust you, to then talk more with you, spend the time to go, okay, I know that, like, for example, DevTools right now, there's no DevTools site. So that's something we're working on so that we can actually have a full documentation site for DevTools. But until then it's like, you know, I'm spending time with people who are, who spent the time like Marina to jump through source code to learn that, then document it. And so when you do these things to show in good faith that you're worth the maintainer's time to invest in you, you know, most maintainers I know would be happy to spend the time with you, because we could always use good help to get more stuff done. It never ends.
Yeah, that's for sure. And you mentioned documentation, and I immediately remember that I should have started helping with the documentation of FormVueLate, and now I'm ashamed because I didn't.
Same here.
Like, I think we're all guilty in this, right? It's like, yep. Apparently we're all in FormVueLate team, and I didn't say this, but yeah, we should have started on documentation, and nobody's like, we should, yeah, maybe one day. So if you're listening to this and you want help with the documentation, please go contribute.
Yes.
So I was asking about a feature you don't like in Vue, right? Mm-hmm. But there is like a moment to ask, is there a feature in Vue 3, maybe in documentation, in RFC somewhere, that you don't understand? Marina? I know you're an educator. I know this is hard to answer. So if you say, I understand it all from A to Z, it's completely fine. But
I don't. Well, I can say for sure that I have not taken a dive yet into the new, the experimental features, for sure. We were talking about behind the scenes a little bit earlier about the new state-driven CSS variables. I have no idea how that works behind the scenes. I know that like a year and a half ago, I took a dive into like how to handle trying to put some sort of like CSS variable from Vue into CSS, and it ended up being a nightmare, like having to inject style tags into like a div and creating these variables, and it actually sort of worked. So this is a very welcome addition, but I have no idea what it is, how it works. Like, it looks amazing, but I haven't had the time to look at it.
Ben, I know you're one of the documentation authors. Be honest, like encourage people.
Yeah. No, and so I think that's what I think people do need to know. Like, while I am on the docs team, you know, a lot of times when you work on docs, you're working on different pieces of it. And so, for example, like Natalia and I worked a lot on migration guide with Marina too, but like, you know, usually we're taking specific sections and that's the section you deep dive on. So for example, all the V model modifiers that Natalia's talking about, yep, that's still kind of over my head a little bit because I haven't spent the time to deep dive the way she has. But I think my more interest part is the big question mark with Vue 3 is how people will take things like the composition API and blow them up at scale. Like what happens when these techniques, which we've like, you know, tried to think through as much as humanly possible, what happens when everyone tries to do the craziness with it? Because, you know, with Vue 2, we had the options API kept everyone sort of confined to a sort of strict way of doing things. And with the composition API and with script setup now, like I think apps are going to look very, very different going forward. And so, you know, I think the education for that will be a tricky piece. So I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of best practices will start emerging over time. I
can uncover one thing. Right now, there are two discussions happening. We have our one that is about Vue.js. And in parallel, there is discussion about Node.js. And there is one person in this discussion who said, I will resist using composition API at GitLab code as much as I can. I will just be blocking it. So you see, like there are some people who are like not going to bring this stuff to our code base. And I can, okay, I'm totally against it, but I can understand the fear, right? Because we don't know how it's going to behave on the scale of GitLab. Speaking about what I don't understand, confession, I have no idea how suspense in Vue is working or gonna work. I mean, it's like there is a thing that is called suspense. I know what it's for. I know that there is this thing in React, and I have a very shallow understanding how it works there. Like, okay, I read it. I have absolutely zero idea how it works in Vue and how to document. So if anyone has any idea here, enlighten me. Like, I believe we're all like a bit more or less on the same page. Like we have idea of why we need it, but I don't know how we're going to document it, but it's true. And speaking about experimental features, I know that Ben was experimenting with experimental features. So could you share a bit of like, what is this and why do we need it and why are you excited about it?
Yeah, so I'm going to leave the style scope one for Marina to talk a little bit about, but the one I'll talk about, if you haven't heard about, is the script setup, which Evan mentioned in his example. So basically you have a script tag with an attribute for setup. And basically what that does is rather than force you to write the boilerplate of like export default, you know, with the object and sort of doing all that boilerplate, you can basically now write plain JavaScript and then export at the end so that you have like expose it. Like it's basically your setup function inside of the script block instead of all that boilerplate. And so I think syntactic sugar like this has the obvious benefit of like, if you know you're using the composition API, then it's like, great, then like, this is my setup block. What I have concerns with is actually similar to Natalia is because what happens when new Vue people go into a code base and now they're going to see script setup blocks and they're going to see option blocks, which are then those are completely different, like basically mental models. And so this is, I think, going to be one of the challenges of education because I do think, like Natalia said, like the composition API we try to reinforce multiple times really should be an enhancement, a tool you reach out to you know, make your code more reusable. But we know there are going to be these people who are going to go the opposite of what Natalia said, which is like, I'm going to use composition API exclusively and like try as little as humanly possible to use options. And so it's going to be really interesting to see the push and pull between the two. Personally, I would like to see people still use the options API for like, especially if you don't need the level of control and freedom that the composition API offers, just because it does like, what we have to remember is that the options API, while we felt restrictions sometimes with what we wanted to do, it provided a set of guidelines for us that everyone could kind of understand from a mental model perspective. But with the composition API, those guardrails are gone. And so bad programming practices and all that stuff, that can still totally apply here. So the composition API doesn't suddenly make your code better. It just gives you more freedom. And with that, we have to be very careful about how that affects our application at scale.
Yeah. I think you did touch upon a very good point there about the education. I feel like Vue 3 is getting into the age of it depends. Like, should I use composition API? Should I use, well, it depends. And inside of composition API, should I be using refs or computed? I mean, reactive. Well, it depends. And just like it's getting really, really confusing. It's like, where should I push people to learn what first, right? I think still that the options API is going to be like the first thing that everyone should learn, just because it provides the basis for everything. But yeah, you make a really good point there.
Yeah, I know. And for me, some points on the composition API, like we have them right now, are a bit controversial when we want to extract things to composables. So like, how do you both feel about, for example, I want to extract things to composable. I want to create a piece of logic that, for example, is responsible for searching. I know I've used this example like a million times. How do you both feel about having lifecycle hooks in standalone composables? Marina first.
I don't hate it. I think the flexibility is very welcome, but I have a fear that the composables are going to be misused. I think that it opens up a very gray zone in between, like, should this be a composable or should this actually be a component? And all this like ambiguity in there are so many choices and so many ways to solve a particular problem that I believe that at some point people are going to start to come out with the best practices, and then that's going to cause a lot of conflict, a lot of very interesting conversations, and I think there's going to be a lot of like preference, like use preference. Like I really like composables. I really, really like them, but I'm scared that too much composables means that encapsulation in components will start to not be the go-to solution. And sometimes it's the easier solution. And I don't know, that I'm still undecided on it.
Yeah, this is like absolutely great points. I was like actually nodding on every point you brought because I agree like this so much with, I mean, if there are many things, many ways of doing a thing, there will be so many ways to shoot yourself in the leg. And I believe this is going to be so. Like, Ben, how do you feel about this?
Yeah. You know, having attended Chris Fritz's proven pattern workshops a lot, you know, I'm of the mindset really when it comes to, you know, as programmers, a lot of times we have these rules of thumbs we try to follow, you know, like writing dry code, and we want to be as efficient as possible. But we know that when we follow rules blindly, we often miss the edge cases and we often dig ourselves in more technical debt. And so my recommendation, again, the composition API is an enhancement for a reason. Like it gives you freedom. But when it comes to code, especially when you're talking about your application at scale, you're talking about people from different backgrounds, different technical abilities. It means that I think writing code in a declarative way that's easier to understand, but then basically using data-driven refactoring. So, you know, when you see that it's necessary to go ahead and then refactor, because it's okay to repeat your code a little bit. And then when you notice it's starting to then become like a burden on your team to like maintain it across, you know, 5 different files, then you have like an argument. But certainly we know that some programmers will feel like they'll make that call immediately. Like, let's go straight to the composition API. And that's where I think people will start shooting themselves in the foot, is because they haven't necessarily proven the use case for it. And to Marina's point, like their composables folder will suddenly be huge and clogged with a bunch of things. Like I still think component driven development is still the right way to start, because that's where your concerns are. And then the composition API is an enhancement on that to help organize that as you see across your application that it makes sense, rather than doing it in advance.
Yeah, I can completely agree with this. My biggest fear here is people will be inventing the solution, inventing the problem for solution, right? They have a composition API. Let's find some problem to solve it because I like the tool. I've seen this so many times when people are just, maybe they fancy some certain technology, framework, tool, whatever. It can be like a concept, like functional programming. I've seen people fancying functional programming. They're like, I want to have functional style in our code base no matter what. I'm very afraid that people will be like, I want to have composables no matter what. I know what I'm going to solve. I have the simplest component in the world, handling like very simple data flow. And here is the composables just to make it more abstracted. And things can go wrong in so many different levels and so many different directions. This is so scary. And in particular, there is a question about Vue that is often asked, and I have like no idea how to answer. Like, can you recommend some best Vue practices? So for me, it's like, I don't know, if you do know any best, do you have something that you call best practice in Vue? Like, let's start with Ben.
Sure. Yeah, best practices is a very popular topic. For those who don't know, we do have a Vue style guide for providing like different categories. And this is one of the first things I loved about Vue was that it provided guardrails for when you wanted an opinion, but did not enforce it in a way that was like basically shoving it down your throat. And so I think it's funny when people talk about best practices, it's kind of like medicine, right? If you're like, oh, I have a headache, what's the best medicine? It's like, well, I kind of need to know what allergies you have. I need to know like how you react to things. And so similar with best practices, I think even the most, we joke that most applications these days are basically a to-do list where you check something and you render a list and then you filter the list. Like that's most applications. But we know that the context for what the user requires, what the product requires is different. And so this is why I think I'd love to see people, when they talk about best practices, be as specific with the context they're in, right? Is it a best practice in an e-commerce solution where you're selling, I don't know, like those things will change very much what that best practice, I think, ends up becoming in the long term. So yeah, I'm basically, that's a very fancy way of saying it depends.
Marina,
Nice.
do you have a silver bullet, like best of best practice you ever used?
I don't think there's a silver bullet either. I think the it depends principle applies again. But I think I try to approach things. At work, I have a very diverse group of people working in the front end from all ranges of experience. And I think I try to approach my component development with one principle in mind, and is the junior going to understand this?
I love that.
Right.
This is brilliant.
Because I'm the tech lead, if I can create this piece of code, complex as it is, and write it in a way that the junior might not grasp the whole thing, but at least is able to read through it and understand what it's doing, then you have a good component. That and the black box principle. Keep everything contained. Just keep everything as contained as you can. But again, best practices, what are the best practices for your team? That is what you need to like, because best practices across the globe, best practices, like Ben said, depending on what market you are, what your end user is, like what you're trying to accomplish, what problem are you trying to solve. Mm-hmm. So I think the best practice is don't over-engineer and make it understandable, because you don't know if you as the author or your team or the people that are working on it right now are the ones that are going to be maintaining it a year or 2 years from now.
Absolutely.
Amen to that.
That's like all great points, not even for Vue, but in general for the front end, not even front end development.
Yeah.
Okay, best practices about this. Worst practices. Name one thing that you have seen in the code. Don't blame people. So it's like, you're a Vue developer. Well, all Vue developers working on a good level. And we've seen things. Mm-hmm. I believe we all did. Name one thing, the worst thing you have seen in the Vue code. Marina.
I feel like I've seen so many things that it's like sometimes pointing out the worst is, I think one of the most common mistakes that I see that just like is don't grab an attribute and make it a property just because like I saw this component, right, that it was wrapping an audio tag, and this person created a source property. And I was like, well, why do we need a source property? Like, is this property going to be used in a handful of spaces? Like, are you going to like parse it, analyze it, put it in an if? No, it's just like injecting it into the audio tag. So if your property is eventually just overriding an attribute, don't do it. You don't need to, I'm sorry. So I think that the point is don't dig yourself in prop nightmare, because sometimes I see people like they create this component, right? Base button. And you open base button and it's the most complex component in their whole architecture, because it has 200 properties. None of them are documented, of course, because and they all play together, right? It's just, no, don't do that. Create a base button with a handful of properties. Don't overwrite attributes, and build on top of this component, extend it, right? I think that is like one of the biggest mistakes I've seen.
This is so nice. And my God, base button. It's like it happens. Expect it to be transparent, but happens to be like super complex thing with million Vuex bindings. Ben, worst thing you have seen with Vue?
Oh gosh. Yeah, worst is hard, Marina, but I think my worst story, I can blame myself for this, is earlier on when I thought I was a brilliant developer by avoiding installing Vuex on my app, and I was saving, a few bytes. I set up this complex event bus thing that I thought I was so clever, and gosh, I hated myself so much a few months into maintaining it, because you have your side effects, your mutations, and you just have no idea what's happening with what. And so that's why I kind of joke with people now, like when you, like Natalia was saying, like when you have a new feature, you want to play around with a lot because you want practice. Like I think that's the biggest thing, right? As developers, when we see the new shiny thing, we want to practice it. It's just then practice it in an environment where it doesn't affect your team. Because create a side project and then just only do composition API. Like that's totally cool. Like get used to it, figure out what works about it. But when you create something that someone else has to maintain, like, oh gosh, I felt so guilty for the people that had to refactor that and then put it into Vuex. I felt so bad. So just something to keep in mind.
Oh, I know this feeling. I was like introducing Apollo client, and obviously there is no best practices for everything. So with Vue and Apollo as well. And I actually experimented in production, so I'm still feeling guilty for people copy-pasting my code across all the code. Sometimes it's questionable. And like the worst thing I have seen, that was partly introduced by me, partly by my team, is a component that contains 2 mixins, and every single mixin of these 2 mixins contains 2 more mixins. So it's like in 3.
A mixin, very
and have absolutely zero idea about where this property came from, and like an icing on the cake. Component has 3 watchers watching mixin properties, and you're like, oh no, what else is going on here? Like, this is like a cryptic part in the code base. Everyone is just afraid to touch because you change something in the mixing of the mixing, and it all falls apart. It's like, if you're trying to abstract things, abstract them in an explicit way. Don't create that many mixins, especially with the composition API. Better experiment with composables. I'm fine with it. Don't end mixins on top of my mixins. This is absolutely the thing. Marina was speaking about something that I can explain to junior. So we are all Vue educators. We all try to teach people to Vue, and people of basically every single knowledge level. Is there a thing that you struggle to explain, like really struggle, that is like, I need to explain this and I don't know how? And if there is a thing, could you please explain it to us in a time slot of 2 minutes, Ben?
Oh, I'm first? Oh gosh, okay. So I think something that I struggle with a bit with more sort of traditional programmers is the why you cannot pass callback functions through props that the child calls instead of declaring an emit properly. And so that's basically a circular argument where people are like, no, it's more, if I define it in the parent, it makes more sense than to define what's emitting from the child. And so basically, if I have to explain it in like a minute, 30 seconds I have left, it's really about sort of trying to keep to Marina's principle of like black box and keeping its scope to where it's coming from. Like, yes, the parent cares about the callback function and those things, but if the child ultimately is the one doing the calling, that's the point of origin, truly. While the responsibility, like the parent may have some, opinions on how that might be defined. But then, use naming conventions if they're tightly coupled. If it's a to-do list that's defining the callback function for to-do list item, then name it that way. Don't name it like to-do list and then like generic item. Because then you're going to be like, oh, to-do list is the one that needs to contain the callback function because generic item is, it's everything. So to Marina's point, like extend your components and go ahead and be declarative about how they're encapsulated. And that way it makes more sense when you're sort of defining those things and feel less the need to like put everything in the parent.
Wow. Marina, your turn.
I think the ultimate thing that is hard to explain, I don't think I can do it in 2 minutes, is scope slots.
I need diagrams. I tried that on a podcast so hard.
It's just impossible. Because let's just assume that people know what a slot is. I'm just like not gonna, okay? So if you know what a slot is, right? How I feel like this needs some sort of metaphor. So, all right. Imagine that you have a cone and that cone is your component and you're gonna put some water in it, right? The parent puts things into the component through properties, right? And then what comes into the component is actually like the component is going to filter it, right, into something. And that something, imagine that after it filters down, it bubbles back up through the sides to the parent, sort of like, I don't know why I kept thinking about the reactor thing in the DeLorean for Back to the Future, but something like that. It just kind of like goes back up like the circulation system in the body. It just kind of goes back up into the parent. That is a scope slot. You put in things, the components process it, and re-exposes a filtered version to the parent. So just imagine this flow inside of the component, and what is coming out on the ends, like what the once it has been filtered by your component is what the scope slot is exposing to your parent. But I think I did a really, really bad job, and I will at someday.
It's like I actually the picture.
Well, like I don't know what the DeLorean thing came into mind.
The question, by the way, in this question is like, in my project, all components are written using single file component with an options API, I guess. How can I have an easy migration to Vue 3? This is such a painful question, to be honest. If there is an easy migration to Vue 3, if yes, will it work faster? Ben.
So to re-clarify the question, they have a components written.
Single file.
They have single file components.
I think Vue CLI based, but maybe not. Or hopefully not Next. So will the migration be easy for them in general?
Yeah, to Natalia's point, this is a complicated question because there's a lot we don't know about your application. But again, I guess let's assume that you are using like standard Vue techniques. You haven't like sort of like used a lot of escape hatches and like doing a lot of render function things. So like the render function API has changed a little bit. So if you're doing standard single file components, Vue CLI, I think with the migration tool, it should be a fairly simple process. Our goal is to it's really those like code bases like Natalia's at GitLabs where people have started stretching, testing the limits of things, like whether they've taken the event bus and done some, unspeakable things to it and, sending things everywhere. That's when you start to run into, because you have these huge dependencies on, like you're pushing Vue to the edge. But if you're basically doing a standard Vue app, I can't see why it would not be a painless migration.
Yeah, I would just add to this that if you were migrating to Vue 2.6, if you have a current syntax, it's fine because there was also slot scope that was deprecated in Vue 2.6. but still working, right? With like one. So if you are sure that you are up to date with Vue, and in general, it should be fine. And again, it depends on your dependencies. Sorry. For
sorry. Yeah, the dependencies. Good call.
Here. In general, it should be fine. But right now, I think if you have like a spherical project that doesn't have any dependencies, it should be fine. But ecosystem, I think, is not that ready right now. Vue Router is in beta, right?
Yeah.
Vuex is in beta as well. Most of the libraries and dependencies
And DevTools is not totally ready yet. And
alpha. Yeah. FormVueLate is ready. So if you want to use form generator, it's there. But VueLate is not. It's alpha. So again, it depends on it. And if you use component library, just
wait.
Yeah,
just wait. It's not worth it.
Marina, do you have anything to add to this?
I was just going to mention the dependencies, but I think you covered it.
Yeah, it's like it really depends right now. How big is the project? How old is the project? Because this might be a pain point. But generally, single file components is, I think, the easiest one for migrate, right? If it would be something written with X templates, I would say, oh God.
And I would, to add on to Natalia's though, there is actually going to be another minor release for 2.7 to further help with that. So if you're not in a huge rush, like if you wait for the 2.7, it should make the migration even easier, just because then you'll make sure that a lot more things are backwards compatible.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe it would be a good idea to wait for this 2.7 build. And this way you will have all the deprecation, because we promised deprecation warnings, things that are deprecated, so you will be easier in terms of migration as well. So we are approaching the end of the discussion. It's like, let's have one more question here. And we were speaking about bad sides, right? What is hard to migrate? What is like bad? What is something that is hard to explain? Let's find one thing in Vue 3 release, because it's ready, that you're actually excited. Just not composition API, so I make it harder, okay?
That's too easy.
Because this is my default answer. Like, I'm waiting for composition API. Everyone is waiting for composition API. And by the way, we missed one part, so I just quickly cover it. Will it be faster? Yes, it will be faster, because the performance of Vue 3 improved a lot. Like in Vue 2, we had functional components, and they were working faster than normal stateful components. In Vue 3, they have more or less the same speed, so you will see the speed up for single file components. So now, outside of composition API, a thing in Vue 3 that you're like, I'm completely happy, I just want to start with it. Marina, because we were starting with Ben for the question, so it's your turn.
I think it's a very particular case for something that I struggle with a lot. I'm really happy that we're going to have teleport. Because I don't know if it's like a case of what I'm actually currently building at work, but it just feels that the application that I'm building is very heavy on modals, very heavy on pop-ups, and things just being positioned in a very weird way with CSS. And sometimes I find myself dropping into this like positioning nightmare with relatives, and just like one of the main reasons that I want to migrate to Vue 3 is just to be able to solve some like very complex logic that I have currently by using teleports that I had to solve with like Vuex flags and, you know, putting pieces of components everywhere. It's horrible. And I think teleport for me is one of the things that I'm definitely awaiting as in a personal level. In a educator level, I think the changes to V model are super exciting. The double V model, I like the V model modifiers, even though you said in the beginning that you're not a fan. I actually like them.
And that's why you should check out her course to understand how they work.
Ben?
Yeah, so for me, I'm going to cover this one, even though it is a bit of an easier one. But I'm actually really excited for fragments, because I can't tell you how I still get the error that's like, you must only have single root element all the time. And so that, I think, combined with the new attribute, like that, a lot of it's like basically merged together, I think will make for a better experience as far as just being able to write HTML the way you want to write HTML rather than wrapping everything in divs and whatnot. So that's mine. What about yours, Natalia?
So I have, again, a confession. I have a Stockholm syndrome. I've been working with Angular for years. So the thing, I'm very excited, and probably half of the people would just, oh God, it's actually a TypeScript. Because
that's such a good point.
You don't need to write all these awful typings everywhere in data and computed. And like, it was surprisingly for me, when I was starting documented TypeScript, I overcomplicated the guide. And I was pointed to this, like, no, you shouldn't do that. Really? It's typed? So if you ever worked with TypeScript on Vue 2, you know the pain. It is a pain. Give it a try with Vue 3. It's just such a smooth and nice way to type everything without pains, without like huge effort. It's like absolutely great. A few questions again from people that are listening to us. Are there any issues and caveats running Vue 2 and Vue 3 on the same page? And I will be selfish. I will answer because we have multi applications on the same page. So here the thing is, it depends on if you have a Webpack. If you're going to run with different CDNs, you can kind of deal with this if you are able to isolate different CDNs for different pieces of the page, and you will be able to use Vue. If you use Webpack, you would need to do an extra work aliasing dependencies because Vue has the same package name.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to add to this, like, please go ahead. But in general, it will probably add some work for you if you use Webpack.
Yeah, so a good example of that, to Natalia's point, is the team was using VuePress, which is using Vue 2, but they were documenting Vue 3 projects, which is using Vue 3. And so things were breaking, as I think a little bit unexpectedly, but when now we know the problem, it makes sense. So if you are using like a VuePress to do your documentation, like I would scope its own package.json, don't conflate it with the main application. Separation of those is very critical.
Okay, I'm muted again and trying to, so sorry to skip Marina, but okay. So would I be able to create components in Vue 3, publish them as NPM package and use them in Vue 2 project? Marina, you're going to answer this, but it's like...
I honestly don't know. I mean, I know that there's this library that someone, I don't remember who was working on, I'm sorry about the non-shout out, but I thought someone was working on some library that allowed you to publish a double version of things. I'm pretty sure Damien was playing with it for FormVueLate that allowed you to target both the composition API and Vue 3 at the same time. So technically, I guess there is a way. I don't know about particularly for components, but I mean, if the component is backwards compatible and you're not using any Vue 3 specific, I don't know what's going to happen with this new release of 2.7 that you were talking about, but I mean, sure. I think it's possible with this. I honestly don't know.
Me neither, but I'm worried about reactivity. Reactivity is a different base reactivity. So it's like maybe it might be possible, but I bet that you will be very limited in terms of, like Marina said, what features you were using in the components, first of all. Mm-hmm. And second is like, there will be consequences. There will be consequences for sure. One more question. Ooh, this is like a thing that I really like this guy. In what aspects Vue is better than React?
Oh gosh. I think we need another hour. No, I'm kidding.
So bad, like very short, like what is better in Vue than React?
Okay, my short answer is basically the learning curve. The fact that it can allow you to do React-like things. You know, you love JSX, fine, go with your render functions, have crazy. But like the fact that we have the single file component and it's approachable from people regardless of skill background, that is basically its biggest selling point.
Marina?
I think Ben nailed it. I love JavaScript. I love JavaScript, but I don't think everything should be JavaScript. I think HTML does its job very well and CSS does its job. And and I think that the separation of concerns for me is just something that makes me happy to work with. And React is very powerful. It's good. It's great. I love React, but I would not switch out to work on it because it just simply doesn't make me happy.
Same. I would say that templates, in my opinion, are like way more better than JSX, first of all. Second is like, I will just steal an answer from chat because I agree with these forms. Forms, like if you ever worked with forms on React, even if it's formic, which is like kind of helps, forms in React is nightmare. Forms in Vue with two-way, okay, let's say two-way binding, right? Because we have it. We have two-way binding. We can make form controllable. We can make form non-controllable. And this is amazing. And I think both Angular and Vue actually win against React in terms of forms. So it's like, I'm looking at Marina's face, like, forms. That's for sure. Like, this is one of the things that actually is better. So I'm just watching the chat and I see people typing and I have no idea if there will be a question or not, but we are on 1 hour again. So I will take one more question and that will be it because we don't have an endless time, unfortunately. So, oh my, this is so conflicting one. When do you think, not if, listen to this. When do you think frameworks will be superseded by native web components? My opinion is short, not during my life.
Mm-hmm.
Ben?
Yeah, I basically agree. Web components have been fighting that battle for a long time, and I just can't see that happening anytime soon. What about you, Marina?
Marina?
I agree. It would require so much of a paradigm shift for so many things in regarding to HTML specs and the way how browsers work in order to exceed what a framework is able to provide.
Yeah, and just tackle that. Like, think how long it took to support Flexbox Grid. Like, and you want to support all your older browsers with web components, this is not gonna happen. So unless you're willing to deprecate, like, ignore all those other users, then maybe. But
and again, it's like, I think there was a rap track from Kids, and like everyone is speaking about native web components. Why nobody is actually using them if they're so good? Why people tend to use frameworks instead? So this is kind of it. And I want to thank you both so much for joining the discussion today. It was a great panel. It was one of the best panels I've ever had at conferences. It was so nice and friendly. So thank you both for joining. And like, I really hope one day we will meet again at online, not online, but offline conference.
yes.
I'll speak about Vue a bit more.
Thanks for having us on.
And have a nice weekend, you too. Hope to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.